I was looking for, and I think all of my team was looking for, is to try and understand from the ground their
Right.
perspective. And we respected indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices as well. So you mentioned Gono Gobeshona. The whole concept of Gobeshona was to listen, no COP, no conference, and yet here we are talking to each other.
Exactly, I know. Well, but probably that's how it should be.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, welcome to today's podcast. My name is Tanzir Hussain, and I am your host today. Today's podcast will focus on the climate justice journey of ActionAid Bangladesh. We have with us Ms. Farah Kobir, the country director of ActionAid Bangladesh.
Hi,
Welcome,
Tanzir.
Appa.
Thank you, Tanzir.
Yeah, Appa, you joined in 2007, and you've been, I would say, taken the lead in terms of bringing the climate justice and the discourse of climate change into the whole development spectrum, not just in Bangladesh,
Oof.
but beyond that within the region, definitely, especially from the development organizational perspective, right? Um, why? Why do you started that the journey?
I think you give me credit, more credit than I deserve. But I can say with comfort that I did start with ActionAid in 2007 June, and what became obvious to me was that we were working to change the lives of the communities, or working together to help them graduate out of poverty, but also enjoy their entitlements and rights. And in the first 6 months that I was working here in Bangladesh, it became very difficult to achieve any of these because constantly there were disasters.
Exactly.
So I had not realized that in a span of 6 months, you could have such diverse disasters. There was flooding, waterlogging, landslides, and then Cyclone Sidor happened, and then drought happened in parts of Bangladesh. I mean,
Yes.
we would never think that there could be drought in this riverine country. But all this made me realize that I have to understand, and along with my team and colleagues, what is happening? What is this climate change discourse? And we are not scientists. So we could only understand from the perspective of the people, the community, and what these changes were doing on the ground. So I felt I felt the urgency, and I felt passionately that we should try and understand. So that's why I introduced it. If you remember in 2008, when we were doing our annual planning, I said to all of you that there are two things we must absolutely not compromise but dive deep into. One is gender justice, and the other is understand climate change. At that point, I had not conceptualized the climate justice part of it. It
Right.
was a journey that happened over the following months, and I could see how climate justice was absolutely crucial for justice and to fight inequality.
Thank you, Appa. Absolutely, you're right. I mean, I think there was a long journey. We learned as we proceeded, went ahead. Um, let's focus on the first 3 4 years. You've already mentioned that, right? Um, we as ActionAid Bangladesh invested a lot in terms of the climate change adaptation in different districts of the Bangladesh. Patuakhali, Sirajganj, floodplains, cyclone
Shatkhira,
areas,
Sylhet.
Shatkhira, exactly. Um, a lot of innovative work that has been introduced. Um, we've engaged a community to do conservation people's research. We facilitated that process.
Sure.
Um, how did you know that this is going to work?
I didn't know. To tell you honestly, it's not that I knew anything. I knew that our communities were dealing with these erratic weather patterns and the frequent disasters, which were becoming intense. So it was quite clear from that perspective. And what I was looking for, and I think all of my team was looking for, is to try and understand from the ground their
Right.
perspective. And we respected indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices as well. So you mentioned Gono Gobeshona. The whole concept of Gobeshona was to listen, to
Yes.
learn, and to engage the communities themselves, to design how they were going to deal with this. And of course, at that point in 2008-9, adaptation was at the top.
Exactly.
And it remains one of the priorities, but we've come a long way in terms of trying to understand different aspects and dimensions of climate change, climate justice. So Gono Gobeshona was with the intention of learning, listening to the community. And you know ActionAid's history, or ActionAid's DNA was related to participatory action. So this comes naturally to ActionAid. And we applied those tools, the perspective, the approach, and the tools. And we went into Gono Gobeshona. And I think the outcome of that was whenever we were designing any adaptation program or projects, it was very much in tune, in tandem with the need of the people. We were not importing a model. We were not just bringing an idea and saying, go with this. So because we were
Right.
clear in our
Exactly.
mind that one size does not fit all.
Exactly. Just to go deep in on that, what you mentioned about communities, community research, and how community research kind of led us to do innovative things. For example, the handloom factory. I don't think anyone thought about it. Or the cluster village for the landless. I mean, looking back, how do you see those interventions? How did it help us to build our knowledge base? Any reflection?
Of course. I mean, as a part of our learning, my learning, we went to COP. And when I went to COP in Bali,
The climate conference.
the climate conference under the UNFCCC, which
Right.
is the UN forum, and COP is the conference of parties that happens at end of the year every year. And we've just had the 27th COP in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. So the idea was for me to learn, but also have our community representatives engage with policymakers, engage with global leadership. And so we took someone from Bara Pabna who had never come to Dhaka. This was a first visit from Bara to Dhaka to Bali. And what she taught me was that while we were debating about adaptation, finding solution, she had already moved 20 times because her house had been, part of her house was lost to river erosion, to the rise in water level, the rains and no rains in her area. So then what was clear was that we need to try and find solutions, but also go deep into what resources have, what skills we have, and design our programs with the community in that manner. So the concept of cluster village, again, because they had lost all their assets.
Exactly.
They lost their land. They had no livelihood. The livestock were suffering because of repeated disasters. So we thought that if we can raise the plinth and create a cluster village, collectively they would be able to support each other and come out of these some of the disasters that they were facing. And interestingly, this is the model that we also shared with the government officials and
Right.
policymakers, and they appreciated this. And this has been replicated in many parts of the world and parts of the country. And you mentioned the handloom factory. So in Shirajganj, which is dominated, the population there is majority weavers. And they were suffering because of no rain, fog, too much rain, and they could not weave. This is their
Exactly.
traditional skill. This is what they were, that's how they got their livelihood. So we bought this space, and together with a local partner created a factory that would help them to continue with their production, and they would be able to produce and continue their livelihood. And so that's another model that we tried to create.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are some of the journeys I think we still refer to as how the adaptation program
Because
should
if
be
you
designed.
remember,
Yes.
we went to a drought area,
Yes.
and we worked with the community there, and we created what we call the Doreen Village, and the Doreen Village was supported. I remember with great respect and love. Doreen, who was from the UK. She was a former FCOT, TFID employee, but she had retired. And she believed in us, and she supported Doreen
Exactly.
Village. And the Doreen Village community, they are no longer in difficulty. They have
Absolutely.
overcome this disaster or this challenge, and the community has managed to move on. The children are doing, we did some interesting projects for the first time with children and climate change, if you remember, the
Right.
debates,
Exactly.
the games they created, and competitions. So yeah, I think there's this aspect of ActionAid that we want to do something new and different all the time.
Exactly. Um, let's come to a bit of policy spaces.
Mhm.
And 2015 was a landmark year in past couple of decades. Some of the major agreement, for example, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Sustainable Development Goals, even the Finance for Development, and the Paris Agreement
Sure.
has been agreed.
Sure.
But your journey started way before that in terms of engaging within the process of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. We remember we started in the Rio Plus 20 conference in Brazil. My question is, it's a huge investment for ActionAid to be engaged in those spaces where many of the other organizations, even from Bangladesh and other spaces, were not engaging. What made you take that challenge and decision during that time?
I think what was my driving force was the whole concept of justice and inclusion. And we know that in these global spaces, it is very, very dominated by the West, by what we call the Annex A countries, or the rich and resourceful, whereas the most vulnerable are in the South. And there was no South voices coming up the way, if you go back to 2008, 9, you will see that it was very difficult. And even at the national level, our government was not engaging to the same. So by default, one had volunteered that time. So I was engaged at the national level. We were the advocates for setting up the Climate Trust Fund, the NAPA, National Adaptation Plan, then the climate strategy. Now, this was very clear coming from the experiences on the ground. But it was also evident that you had to make the link. You act locally, you think locally, but you have to go to the global stage. And what best way to go other than take the stories? Because ActionAid is very rooted. Our work is not, where do we get the mandate? We are not political actors.
Absolutely.
We are not, so our only mandate is because the communities have accepted us, and the communities are willing to partner with us, and together we try to bring the change. So I was clear that we needed to invest in this process. And unless I was, and ActionAid Bangladesh colleagues understood what happens at these global spaces, how we can get our voices there, because now you can see how difficult it is for civil society to participate.
Absolutely.
And there have been moments where civil society was not given the space, or it was made very, very difficult. Now, going to Rio Plus 20 was a decision, because Rio Plus 20 was the first for a Rio, and the Rio Summit was the forum that brought to attention the Earth Summit, the environmental issues. So there was a reason to take it there, and then continue with the COP process,
Exactly.
Conference of Parties process. But it would not have been enough just by attending. I had to make sure that we were all deeply rooted in our initiatives, in our activities, in the research. We did a lot of action research, in the policy briefs, because I could make immediately the link between climate change, the disasters, and environment, and gender justice. And so I became a very vocal advocate for justice, and therefore climate justice, gender justice, and to inclusion.
Exactly. I mean, we remember that when you've been like elected and as or I mean, you are among the 100 women champions. I think it was 2013 or 2014.
13.
13, yeah. And then the slogan was no climate justice without gender justice.
Absolutely.
Do you want to reflect a bit on that? What exactly does it mean?
You see, when you look at the impact of climate crisis,
Yes.
you can see whether it is from the perspective of displacement, it impacts women differently. You can think of it from the lens of loss of agriculture, agroecology, livelihood. Again, it has an impact on women. And if you look at from the social dimension, so if there is waterlogging, if there is repeated typhoons and cyclones, the whole families and the communities are getting displaced or uprooted, and they're having to survive. And when they're in difficult situations, one of the ways they address is they have to sacrifice, or they decide that child marriage, or putting boys and girls into work and all this. So this has a strong implication.
Exactly.
And that is why it was very clear to me that we have to talk on those aspects. It's not just about discussing on the I's and T's at the climate conference, on the negotiations and the agreements. It's about the real lives, and how so the gender justice was very critical, because already women, girls, people of different sexual orientation, Adivashis, persons with disabilities, were in a secondary position. They were in second class, third class citizens of their countries. On top of that, climate change was adding a further layer of difficulty for them. So it wasn't very difficult for me to make that linkage, because I was always very passionate about justice.
Exactly. I mean, when you were making that linkage, you also represented in the Climate Action Network South Asia. You've been a board member there. You were also the chair of the board of the Global Network of Disaster Risk Reduction. And that has both policy aspect as well as the programmatic aspect, as you just said, bringing those voices into those platforms, right? Tell us a bit about the strategies or your journey in terms of influencing the network itself, and then how it was linking to influence the global processes.
I think, as I always joke, the woman in the sari going around arguing and debating about how climate justice is all about gender justice.
Yeah.
In Sendai, after the Sendai agreement was signed, when we were all in Sendai advocating for disaster risk reduction, preparedness, investment, all the different aspects of it, the Global Network on Disaster Risk Reduction, they elected me to become the chair of the global board. And I found this was a platform of networks. And there are now over 1,000 networks who are members of GNDR. So I worked as the global chair and influenced in developing 2 strategies. So, and they're now going to be developing another strategy. It's already, the process is there. So what I added to all this was my perspective, feminist perspective, my interest in justice and equity, and that helped to design along with all the other board members. And because it's such a diverse group, GNDR has representation from all over the world.
Exactly.
It was a fantastic opportunity for me to learn, and I hung on to it with everything I had, because this was my learning opportunity, and I gave whatever I could, within my capacity. But the relationship, the partnerships, the initiatives that we took were appreciated. And I was, for a long time, also the South Asia representative for GNDR while I was the board chair. It was only last December that I completed my term. And so it was the ability to articulate and present is probably why I had been elected by the members. And Cancer Climate Action Network, again, this is the network where I was bringing the feminist perspective. And, it was not so well articulated there, but it has moved on. So I was on the South Asia board. Now I'm the co-chair of the national board of cancer in Bangladesh. And then I got in, and see, climate change manifests in many ways. One of the problems that were happening as a result of climate change was displacement.
Exactly.
So I got engaged with the Nelson Initiative, where they were trying to understand how climate change was impacting on displaced people, what were the issues. We organized the first event in Khulna for Nelson Initiative, and then Nelson Initiative has now moved into and become the platform for disaster displacement. Yeah. I was there at the Nelson Initiative. I'm now an advisor on the advisory group of Platform for Disaster Displacement. Because where I come from, it's not just about theory, and it's not just about arguing that this is all should be seen from the governance lens only or from the disaster lens only.
Exactly.
For me, it is what is impacting the people on the ground. And where it should be emphasized is the whole discourse of justice. True. And feminist principles, values, are such values and principles that take you towards that.
Very true. And I think what you've been doing has been reflected in many ways in the global forums. I mean, it's just last week, GNDR has been speaking about women's engagement, women's rights in disaster risk reduction. And I was joking, as like, maybe we should not come here because the job is done. But yeah, definitely, I think
the job is never done.
Yeah, I know, but I think the progress we've made under your leadership is tremendous. I think a couple more questions for you. While we are talking about disaster risk reduction, climate, we see a lot of humanitarian crises taking place. We are seeing a lot of conflict is being, conflicts are on the rise. How do you see it's interacting, the conflict, climate, development, peace? What message do you want to give to the organizations such as ActionAid working in that forum? How should we be prepared for, or what we should know?
See, Tanzir, when we started to delve deeper into the climate discourse and try and understand the different impacts, the manifestations of it, one thing that first and foremost were being said is there will be frequent disasters. And if you look at Bangladesh, in 10 years, we've had over 200 disasters in many forms and shapes, right?
Yes.
So disasters were going to increase, is what the IPCC report has been saying. 3, 4, whichever one you study. If you can't see it, then it's sad. But this is so. Climate change induces greater number of disasters. When there is disasters, people are losing. This is why from 2016, I put my energy, ActionAid Bangladesh's energy, Action Federation's energy, along with other organizations on loss and damage, trying to understand. So when you lose your childhood, you lose certain losses which cannot be replaced. It creates trauma.
Absolutely.
And then when you lose your resources, your house, your cattle, your agriculture, the damage that it does to you is the source for creating conflict. If there is an existing conflict, then it exacerbates that conflict. So I appreciate this question because we have to think in a comprehensive manner.
Yes.
Often what we do is we try to, it's like a Band-Aid approach. We deal with disaster here. We're not looking at the root and the
Bigger picture.
Yeah. And then if we're talking about the climate crisis, that group is not trying to look at how it's impacting the community and the women in Pacific or in Maldives or in Mauritius or in Bangladesh or in India or Nepal. So we have to look at the whole spectrum, right?
Yes.
As our policymakers have a tendency to come up with piecemeal approach, and whatever interventions they're suggesting is again ad hoc, it is generating certain level of tension and therefore conflict. And I would say that in ActionAid, the ActionAid Federation, the leadership needs to think of the whole comprehensive picture, and our support, our interventions, innovations has to be around this.
Right.
Because you can say, why is child marriage or increase in salinity and thus leading to health crisis related to all justice issue?
Absolutely.
But for me, it's obvious. And I would go down that.
Thank you, Appa, for the comprehensive idea and guidance for not just ActionAid, for others as well. We are almost at the very end, and I would like to request for your final few words to not just to ActionAid or any other organization, to the audience as a human being, as like, what should we do in everyday life, combating climate crisis and so on.
I think you've asked a good question at the end, that we have to change our behavior. As humans, everything matters. Whether you are using a plastic product, single-use plastic product,
Yes.
whether you are consuming too much water and wasting, whether you're consuming more food than needed, or you are you have too many clothes and shoes, and so everything can be added. But those are small initiatives. The main thing is we all have to come together to move away from fossil fuel dependency.
Yes.
Our source of energy has to change. We have to go for green transition. So while individuals must take on their own behavioral changes, we collectively have to go and make sure that there are no more investments in fossil fuel.
Yes.
We are investing in green transition for a better world. We have gone beyond the 1.5 degree heating temperature, right?
Yeah.
So the next years are going to be even more difficult. With that in mind, we have to work collectively.
Absolutely. And that transition has to be just and feminist,
Absolutely.
based on feminist principles.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Farapa, for your time today. It's been wonderful. It's always a learning journey to listen to you, and I hope the audience, whoever is listening, will benefit from it.
We
Thank
have
you.
to work together.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.